If you've ever had a garden failure, whether you knew it was your fault or you couldn't figure out what went wrong, this episode is for you. To be honest, this isn't an easy episode for me to make. After all, you have heard me championing the fall garden year after year, teaching you strategies to help you be successful in your fall garden. And yet, this year, I've found myself with more failures than successes. It's frustrating. It's discouraging. And given what I do, teach people how to garden, it's more than a little embarrassing. But here's the thing you have told me time and time again. You appreciate when I'm honest. You appreciate when I share my struggles, when you see that I don't have it all together. So there are two reasons why I decided to share this episode with you. One, we all have failures, despite what you may see online, and I want you to know that you're not alone. I want us both to have compassion on ourselves, even with the things that we didn't get right. And two, I want you to learn from my failures. In some of these examples, like with potatoes, you'll see I had a pretty good idea what I did wrong. But in others, like carrots, I'm speculating what happened, but I'm still kind of stumped. But either way, you'll leave this episode with ideas that will hopefully help you find ways to tweak what you do and increase your harvest in the future. And one more thing, not all of my fall garden was a failure. I'll share with you at the end what went perfectly well. So if you have had struggles in those areas, you can borrow from what I did right to help you nail it too. Hey, before we get started, I wanted to let you know that my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, is now open for fall enrollment. We only open Dream to Garden 3 times a year, and our past fall students have told me that this was the best time to join. That way they could watch the videos and plan their garden at a slower, more thoughtful pace without having to rush through the lessons to get things planted in time. Plus, joining in the fall is best for those of you in warmer climates, zone 7 and up, because you'll be planting many cool season crops as early as January. Learn more about Dream to Garden by visiting the link in the show notes, but for now, as we chat today, listen for when I planted these fall crops that we're going to be talking about, both the failures and the successes. For the most part, plant timing was not the issue. With the principles I teach in Dream to Garden, not knowing when to plant is a problem solved. And from what I hear from many of you, when to plant is one of the biggest question marks in planning your garden. Fall enrollment is only open for a short time, and then we won't open again until February. I hope that if Dream to Garden is your next right step, you'll take this first step to your best planned garden in 2025. Want to jump in and don't want to wait? Go to journeywithjill.net/dreamtogarden or visit the link in the show notes. Fall garden failure number 1, and I'm really having a hard time swallowing this, is carrots. This is so hard for me. I was just thinking about this yesterday when I went to grab some carrots from my spring and summer harvest to cook, and I realized I'm getting low on my stock. And this will be the first year since I first started a fall garden that I won't have carrots until next summer, and I'm really bummed about it, especially since I've followed, at least I think that I followed, all of the things that I have done in the past that have made fall carrot planting successful. Clearly not, because something didn't go right. But let me share with you what I did, what I suppose may have happened. And hey, you guys, if you see something I don't see, I am all ears. I would rather not repeat this experience. When did I plant carrots? That would be the biggest question. I planted these from seed in mid-August out in my garden. This is a plant timing that I've been doing for a while. I used to wait till early September. I found that I actually had better success in mid-August, especially getting the carrots to be able to get mature before winter and then also continue harvesting all winter long in my zone 8A winter. And it's hard for me to even say that because I love fall carrots are so delicious. They're so much better than winter carrots. I'm still mourning that. All that to say, I planted from seed in mid-August in 2 different beds. I thought I did everything the same as usual. I figured out later that I didn't, but I waited I waited. And carrots can typically take 2 to 3 weeks to sprout, but usually in the late part of the summer, they don't take that long just because the soil is still warm. But I couldn't figure out why it kept taking so long. Now, this year I did something different compared to what I've done last year. And this may be the reason why all of this failed. I'm not for sure. But usually in the fall and even in the spring, sometimes just depending on the year, I will, after planting, I will put a floating row cover directly on the soil to be able to capture moisture. Now, a lot of people do this with carrots, but they may use something like burlap sack or cardboard or piece of wood. I really like floating row covers because if those carrots start to sprout and I don't see it in time, then they won't get light in time. So I like the floating row cover just flat on the top of the soil so they can get light immediately. But the point of that is to keep the moisture in the soil so that the seeds have access, those sprouts have access to moisture right away. That soil moisture tends to evaporate really fast in the late part of the summer because it's still hot outside and there's evaporation and all of that. So this is why making sure that the soil is irrigated from time of planting all the way through sprouting is so essential. But this year I didn't do this because I had put it on the raised beds where I had my Garden in Minutes garden grids on. And I know from experience, those garden grids, when they are running every day, that soil stays moist. It just does. It's a fantastic irrigation system. I loved it. But what I realized is after those 2 to 3 weeks and I didn't see sprouting, I realized when I went out to check the irrigation just to make sure all was good, that I had shut off the grid and I hadn't turned it back on. I actually had squash in that bed and I took them out because they got killed with a squash vine borer, and this is probably in July, and I knew I wouldn't be planting anything else until mid-August, so I shut off the irrigation to save water from that particular bed, but I forgot to turn it back on when I planted the seeds. So that was frustrating because we hadn't gotten rain, and here we are, these seeds had no moisture. So of course that was what happened, right? Well, I was a little skeptical, partly too, because I told you I planted in 2 raised beds. The other one that I planted in, I did have irrigation on it, but those seeds weren't sprouting either, which I thought was really, really strange. So I went ahead and replanted about maybe 3 weeks after. So maybe the early part of September, I replanted just to see if, okay, now that I've got the irrigation going, maybe they'll sprout. And a few did, but maybe 3 or 4. And I still don't know what happened. Now, I do wonder if maybe some of those sprouted and they just got attacked right away from grasshoppers, because grasshoppers are really bad in the late part of the summer. And maybe the grasshoppers just got them before I ever saw anything. Although part of me would think that I would have at least seen a stub, but I don't know. I'm just thinking what might have happened. And had I covered with a floating row cover like usual, that would have prevented the pest damage if that were the case. But it just never did happen. I got a few that sprouted and I ended up just giving up on those because that particular bed, I just decided, okay, I'm just done. I'm going to prepare this bed for spring and be done with it. So I went ahead and gave up on the 3 that I had. But even looking back, I think, what happened? Why did these seeds not sprout? And one question to ask would be, could it have been the seeds? Now, if I would have sown the same seed in all of the bed, yeah, it could have been bad seed. But I sowed 5 different varieties of carrots, and almost all of them I had also sown in the spring, and they did fine. So I knew that the seeds were fine. So that wasn't it. The other thing I would think of is that it was so hot, especially in parts of September when the sprouting should have happened. And what I'm thinking may have happened was that even with daily irrigation, the soil that I was planting in was actually a little bit too well draining. If you feel the consistency of the soil that you're planting in, a lot of times you can tell whether something isn't completely right. And I've been using this compost for years, and it's always been this way, but there was something about this particular compost that was just a little more gritty than normal. And I don't know if it's because it was sitting a little bit longer or because we were so dry and it just any moisture that it had in it had evaporated. I'm not quite sure, but I'm thinking that even with daily irrigation, perhaps the water wasn't able to stay in the top portions of the soil because you've got number one, it's so hot, so evaporation is happening really quickly. And number two, you've got this really well draining compost that I had topped off the bed with. So maybe between those two things, there just wasn't enough moisture, even with daily watering. So I really think that that was probably the reason. And then because I hadn't put the floating row cover on top, it was either too hot or too dry or both to sprout. Or if the sprouts did push up, then they possibly could have withered very quickly because they didn't have enough water and it was really hot. I think, like I said, a third possibility would have been the grasshoppers, but I really think I would have seen more evidence of a nub that they wouldn't have gotten completely to if that were the case, but I'm not quite sure. All that to say, I'm not 100% sure what happened, but next year, I'm definitely going to make some changes. I'm not going to do the exact same thing I did this year. Next year, I'm going to use the floating row cover again, but I'm going to do it on top of the Garden in Minutes grid because I did that last year. And as long as I put the floating row cover right on top of the grid and I didn't have space in between, if I had too much space in between, then it would create this greenhouse effect that ended up making the environment really hot. I learned that lesson last year. But thankfully, I was able to correct it in time and I was able to get a good harvest. But for the fall of next year, I'm going to lay the floating row cover flat on top of the Garden in Minutes grid so that it can maintain as much moisture as possible. Another thing I may consider, if the compost that I have next year, and just a reminder, this is bulk compost. This isn't my compost that I make myself, but it's bulk compost. If I use that and I find that it has that gritty kind of texture that I don't feel like is going to retain water very well, I may end up mixing the top of it, at least the top few inches, with topsoil or a potting soil mix so that it can retain water a little bit better, at least until the carrots get established. I found in general that well-draining compost is actually fantastic for carrots because they don't have to power through any clay or rocks or anything like that. But just at that top layer, maybe doing something to make sure that the soil moisture is retained, then that will be my plan for next year. And hopefully I won't have another fall carrot fail like I did this year. Garden fail number 2 is potatoes. I know, I just did a whole episode on planting fall potatoes, so I felt like I had everything in place to do better this year. And I felt like in the beginning it worked really well. So I actually grew these fall potatoes in 2 different places and I learned 2 different lessons. The first place that I planted them was in grow bags. I planted them in 15-gallon grow bags. These are the lined grow bags from Epic Gardening. You may have seen a YouTube video on that. If you haven't, I'll put a link in the show notes to that. But these grow bags are what I used to grow some potatoes in the spring, and I was really pleased with my harvest. I felt like they were healthy, they did well. I couldn't have been happier with that. So I went ahead and planted potatoes in those same grow bags on July 27th. They sprouted quickly. These were seed potatoes that I'd bought from Wood Prairie Family Farm. They sent them to me in the middle of the summer. It's pretty much impossible, at least from my experience, to get seed potatoes at your feed store or a lot of other places in the middle of the summer. But Wood Prairie sent them. They were still shipping at that time. And they were already starting to sprout, which means they were ready to start growing. And they did. They sprouted really quickly. Again, planted them on July 27th. And I put shade cloth on them immediately because in my experience, potatoes do not like the high heat that we get in August and even September. So I had shade cloth on them immediately, but they did start growing really tall. And that is an indicator based on past experience in my garden that it's too hot. When I start seeing potato plants growing really, really tall, no matter what variety they are, usually it's in the hottest part of the season, and I knew that that was probably a bad sign because it showed that they were a little bit stressed. The leaves also started to look a little bit purple. almost like they were nutrient deficient. I started looking at purple leaves on potatoes online, and I started getting all these diseases, and I really don't think they had any disease. I really just think they had some kind of issue taking up nutrients. And as of this recording, I really don't think I'm going to get much of a harvest if the growth was any indicator. And that's a good indicator with potatoes is if you get really lush growth, you're probably going to get a better harvest than if you have growth on the top that's struggling. It just doesn't have enough to nourish a good potato harvest. So what ended up happening? Why did I have issues with this particular planting when I used the same method in the spring with completely different results? My number one mistake that I'm pretty sure that probably contributed was I ended up using the same soil. I know you're probably like, ding, 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 that was it. But I added new soil, added new compost. I just reused what I had, but I added new. But I think that I don't think it was enough. I also added a little bit of fertilizer to each of those bags, but I just don't think it was enough. I had every intention of continuing to fertilize these plants throughout the season with liquid fertilizer, but I just ended up not doing it. And so I just don't think they had enough nutrients. I also companion planted these potatoes with a greens mix. I planted the seed potatoes in these 15-gallon grow bags. I think one seed potato, maybe two per grow bag. Once it sprouted, I added a mix of greens to the top of the soil because I knew that the growth would be at the bottom of the soil of the potato, and then I could take advantage of that extra space for greens. I'm not sure if that may have hurt. That's one thing that I just don't know. But this particular greens mix, they were a brassica mix, so I'm not sure. I'd probably have to look up to see if brassicas and potatoes companion planting might have a negative reaction with each other. I'm just not sure. But that might be something I'll look at in the future. So for next season, just as a lesson for me, I don't want to use the same soil. If I did grow in grow bags in the spring, I probably want to completely start with new soil for the fall if I'm going to grow potatoes. If I were to grow something else, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But the potatoes, I feel like probably that was the case. And then also, I need to add more fertilizer during the season to make up for the additional watering I had to do because it got so hot. When it's that hot, when those potatoes are growing, there's more water. The potatoes are taking them up. But with that more water in a container, that's more nutrients being flushed out. So I need to be more diligent in watering if I do that with grow bags next year. The other place that I planted seed potatoes was in my GreenStalk vertical planter. I've had good success with this in the past, especially in the spring. And these, again, seed potatoes from Wood Prairie, they were planted on August the 2nd. Actually, some were from Wood Prairie. I think some were from sprouted potatoes that I had harvested in the spring. I think I had a mixture of that. But interestingly, most didn't sprout. They sprouted in the grow bag, but they didn't sprout in the GreenStalk, and I thought that was really strange. So eventually, when I realized, okay, all these other potatoes are up and these are not, what's wrong? I started digging around in there, and I mostly found rotted out seed potatoes. And what I realized had happened was that I'd still had my GreenStalk on the automatic timer with the GreenStalk irrigation system called the GreenStalk Spring, which to me is so nice. I didn't have to hand water my GreenStalks hardly all this year. I had 4 out of my 5 GreenStalks hooked up to that GreenStalk Spring. The only one I had to hand water was the 5th one. But just to have that on a timer all summer was so great. But there's a downside to that. But I didn't realize until it was too late that I feel like that soil was getting watered too much. So that overwatering kept that soil too saturated. And I believe that that's why those seed potatoes rotted, was because it was just too wet because of my own mistake of not watching the irrigation a little bit better. Another thing, though, is that I did companion plant those seed potatoes in with plants that were already established. So I wasn't overwatering those plants. Those plants still needed all that water, but the seed potatoes didn't need all that water. So that's another thing I'm going to be looking at next year as far as GreenStalk and watering, is the different watering needs of different stages of growth. A mature tomato plant that I think I still had in one of my GreenStalks is going to need a lot more water than that seed potato. So that may need to be considered next season. But once I realized what had happened, I replanted some seed potatoes that had started sprouting in my pantry, and I cut back on watering, and those plants started growing immediately. They are looking the very best. They're still actually doing really great, whereas the other ones in the grow bags are, I think, kind of done. I'm going to wait until I get done with the greens, and then I'll see if there's anything down there for me to harvest, but I'm not hopeful. But for the green stalk ones, those plants are looking really good. The problem is that we're headed into winter, and even with the greenhouse, I'm not sure they'll have enough light to really produce much of a harvest because I ended up, replanting them too late. But I did learn a really valuable lesson there, and that is you can probably hear that with seed potatoes, I have to be really careful not to overwater or they might not be able to sprout at all. So lesson learned on the fall potatoes, and hopefully I'll be able to carry those lessons into trying another potato harvest next fall. Just wanted to take a quick break before we talk about my spinach failure to give you a little bit more information about my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden. In this self-paced online course, you'll watch video lessons where I teach you how to plan your garden, from smart crop selection to plant timing in your particular climate to maximizing your season and space with succession planting and companion planting, to drawing out your garden layout, to planning all of your garden tasks out on your year-long calendar. All of this so that your garden is planned out before you plant a seed. So when the time comes, you can focus on the fun part, which is planting and growing your garden. Fall is the perfect time to jump in. The days are shorter and your mind has more space to be able to dream when you don't have a nagging list of to-dos in the back of your mind. Plus, you'll get support from our members-only Facebook group and support and answers to questions within the course itself. This will be the last time that we open Dream to Garden until mid-February, so don't wait. Get a head start on your dream garden by joining Dream to Garden today at journeywithjill.net/dream to garden. I hope to see you in the course. Garden fail number 3 was a new way that I tried to plant spinach. Here's the challenge with me, at least in my zone 8A, where we're still very hot in September. In fact, at the end of October, we broke a 97-year record for record highs. Now, that's not typical, but it's not uncommon for us to have hot Octobers as well. The challenge with spinach then for fall for us is that spinach seeds do not like sprouting in hot soil. And if we still are hot or warm, then the soil is going to continue to be hot for a long time. When I planted my seeds in September in past years, I had a really hard time with them sprouting with any kind of consistency. And I think a lot of that had to do with the hot soil. But what I started doing in past years was, and many of you have heard me talk about this before, is I started planting those spinach seeds in October when the soil had at least started to cool down a bit. Those cool nights at least kind of helped that soil temperature come down. And that worked really well because the seeds would sprout really well in October. But the problem is that we're getting down to really low daylight. And so I never was able to get a fall harvest of spinach because the spinach wouldn't grow fast enough. Thankfully, spinach is very cold hardy, so it would last through the winter. And then I would end up getting a harvest in February, which is great. I'm not complaining about that. But this year, I really wanted to figure out a way to possibly get fall spinach. The challenge I knew I had was, how do I get these seeds to sprout? And in the past, I had tried starting spinach seeds indoors and they didn't do very well once transplanted. But I thought, you know what? Let's just try this again. And I actually tried a trick that I learned from Joe Lample in one of his workshops, which, by the way, whether you join one of my workshops or someone else's workshops, that someone that is a garden teacher that you trust, don't discount the value of these more in-depth learning experiences, because whether it's Joe or me or someone else, we take the time to really dig deeper into topics that you may not get otherwise. But I just wanted to give a shout out to him because I had actually attended his fall garden workshop because I'm always trying to learn. And I learned this trick about priming spinach seeds. You never know what little tidbits you might learn with things like that. And priming spinach was one of those things. So, what I ended up doing with my spinach seeds is I soaked them for 24 hours in water. Then I let them dry out and then I planted them. I did a test because I thought this would be fun. I planted some inside in my grow room where we were, 76 degrees, maybe ambient temperature. And then I also planted those same seeds outside where the soil was still pretty hot. I think this was early September. I really wanted to do it earlier than that, but I ended up doing this in early September. And I wanted to test to see what the germination rate was compared to outside. And what I found was really interesting. The seeds that I planted, now all of these were primed, remember, I'd soaked them in room temperature water, let them dry out, and then I planted. The seeds that I planted inside sprouted in just 3 days at a near 100% germination rate. It was incredible to see all of these spinach seedlings germinate so fast. I'd never seen spinach germinate so fast. The outside ended up sprouting in 7 days. Again, these were the ones that were primed, but I planted them outside. They sprouted in 7 days, but the difference was only 2 sprouted among the dozens that I had planted. So that reiterated what I had known about the soil temperature being an issue, and perhaps water, even though I had an irrigation on them constantly, it could have been that soil just dried out because it was very hot outside. So it may not have just been soil temperature. It could have also been retention of soil moisture, just like the challenge that I ran into with carrots. I'm not quite sure, but the whole point was that everything sprouted when I planted them indoors. 2 of them sprouted outdoors. But then I had another challenge, which was planting the indoor sprouted seedlings outside when it was still so hot. We were in the mid-90s, and I know spinach doesn't like the heat, and I also know that spinach seedlings are very picky. They will bolt at a drop of a hat because if they don't like just one little thing about their environment, they start bolting. I ended up planting these spinach seedlings, transplanting them in my garden about 2 weeks after they sprouted, but I could tell they were already starting to get stressed. They had roots growing out the bottom. I wasn't overly optimistic because I know spinach is picky. But still, I went ahead and planted them outside. I planted them in a couple of different places in my garden. And what I found with this is that most of them bolted immediately, particularly in a bed. It was my round raised bed. I don't know if you remember seeing this on Instagram, but it was my round raised bed that I had peppers in the center of it, and then I had planted sweet potatoes all around it. Well, what I ended up doing is after I harvested the sweet potatoes out of that, and the peppers were still living because we hadn't gotten our first freeze yet, I planted these spinach transplants in place of the sweet potatoes. All of those bolted immediately, and they eventually all ended up dying, and part of that is because I didn't water them enough because they didn't have an automatic irrigation. I tried to, but even when I was watering them, they bolted immediately, which meant, if you're new, bolting is when a plant is stressed enough to where it stops producing the vegetative or the leaf growth and starts to send up a flower stalk to be able to set seed. Basically, it's saying, I'm getting ready to die. I need to set some seed so that I can make sure that we get another generation. But that means that that's not good for the gardener because if a spinach plant bolts, that we're not going to get a good spinach harvest. The ones that are in a bed that did have a drip irrigation on them, they have drip lines. This is my U-shaped bed, so I don't have my garden in minutes grid on it. A lot of those bolted also, but not all of them. The last time I looked out there are some that ended up taking well and didn't end up bolting. But at this point that I'm recording this, we're at the later part of October, so I really don't have any hope for this fall planting of spinach in general. But I'm hoping that I didn't completely mess myself up by all of this and then them all bolt and I don't get even a February harvest. I may end up, planting some seeds late and see how those do. But all that to say, they're still growing kind of slow. So time will tell. If they don't bolt, I think they'll be fine for the fall and winter. But I did learn a lot by this experiment here. Number one, next season, if I plant indoors, which I'm not sure if I will, but the germination rate is so much better. So if I try this again, I will transplant as soon as I can after they sprout. So as soon as they sprout, I'll go ahead and transplant them before the root grows much longer than the cell that I'm planting it in. I think that was a big problem. And that has been in the past for me. I feel like you have to be real careful with spinach because it doesn't like to be transplanted. But if I can sprout it indoors and then plant it immediately, I've had better success with plants like that, like beets. I've done that way. I will try to plant them out faster and then immediately put them under shade cloth. And I'd have to be real careful to keep them irrigated well in the beginning to prevent them from bolting. So that would be another test that I would do if I plant indoors to try to get early. And then in the future, I may try to plant 2 plantings. One, I may try to get early, maybe to try to get a fall harvest, maybe plant earlier and see how it goes. Making sure we have shade and irrigation. That's the only way I can imagine that would work. But then another one is to plant in October like I always have, and then use it as an overwintered crop. Because February, I'm thrilled to have spinach. There's not a whole lot that's growing in your garden in February, especially in a climate like mine where we do get cold winters. So it's really nice to have a whole crop of spinach. So I may end up planting 2 plantings. But all that to say, spinach has not been the easiest crop to grow. I hear that from so many of you that you really struggle with spinach. And I just also shared this with you because I want to keep trying because I do enjoy spinach, but I also recognize that it's a challenge. So if you had trouble with spinach in the past, just know that it's a little bit more of a challenging crop and don't feel like you're a terrible gardener if you've had those challenges, but just keep testing things. I mean, I've been gardening for over 10 years and I'm still trying to figure out how to make this work in my climate. That's another thing. Don't compare yourself to other gardeners, especially gardeners who are in different climates than you. There might be a gardener who has a much different climate that spinach works so much better and it's so easy. We can't compare ourselves to each other because we all have individual challenges. And for me, with spinach, heat would be one of them. So that's one I'm still going to continue to try to tweak and maybe get better and better. Those are the 3 garden fails. And to me, they were pretty big, especially the carrot one. The potatoes, potatoes in the fall haven't been all that reliable. So I'm not too sad about that one. I didn't depend on that one like I do carrots. The spinach was a fun experiment, but more of a learning process. One of those things where you're learning and it's good for you, but you kind of wish you didn't have to learn it that way. That's kind of how I felt about the spinach. But I do want to share with you what did work well, because it's not like my entire fall garden was a failure. Some key crops were for sure, but there's also lots of good that's still going really strong. And what went well were in 2 categories. Number 1, broccoli and cabbage. These are one of these crops that I've pretty much got a system going, and I'm tweaking different things over the years just to see like what works better, what doesn't work, and just continuing to observe. You never stop learning, but I have a pretty good system going with broccoli and cabbage. I sowed these seeds indoors on July 20th. I potted them up, which means I took them from a smaller container to a larger container, not that much larger, just a step up, on August 15th, and then I transplanted them on August 31st. What I found this year is that the cabbage started forming heads earlier than ever, and the only difference in this year's planting is that where I planted the cabbage was in my kitchen garden, which is the first time I've done that, I think, at least this early, and they're getting direct sun. So that's really the only difference that I could tell between this garden and previous fall gardens, is that my other fall gardens are in my main garden area, which has more shade. So they're getting direct sun. I think that made a big difference because they're pretty much ready to harvest the end of October, and I've never had cabbage harvest that early. Now, not all of the varieties are ready. I did plant different days to maturity varieties, which I think was a really great idea because I've got Farao, F-A-R-A-O. I always have to spell that because I don't know exactly how to say it. But that's been my tried and true cabbage, but it's a smaller cabbage and it's earlier days to maturity. So that's ready. But I have a couple of other larger cabbages that are longer days to maturity that they won't be ready for a little bit longer, which I think will be great because I'll have a more protracted cabbage harvest over the fall, which I think is really good. With broccoli, I learned a few interesting things. I planted my broccoli in my kitchen garden, same thing, full sun. I had a particular variety called Gemini that I'd planted in the spring and it did really well, but I didn't have room to put it in my raised bed where I had insect netting on top of it. And if you are on my email list, you've heard me talk about this already because I shared it with you as soon as it happened. I thought this was really, really strange. But the Gemini, I ended up planting out in my a U-shaped raised bed, but I didn't put insect netting on top of it because I just had 2 plants and they were on 2 opposite sides of the beds and it just wasn't worth it. I just figured I'll just pick off the cabbage worms if I need to. But they didn't have any cabbage worm damage. And I don't know if it's because the variety is resistant. I don't know if it's because the plant was healthier, the soil was healthier in some way. They also formed heads the fastest. Now, one reason I planted Gemini is because they're an early days to maturity crop. But so are some of the other ones I planted next to each other in this other different raised beds, but they didn't form heads as quickly. And the heads that the Gemini plants formed were large compared to the ones that I planted in my raised bed that I honestly planted too close together. I knew I planted them too close together. They were probably 10 inches apart, which is really intensively planting broccoli. But I'm seeing the difference between the one that had plenty of room and the one that are really close to each other. And the one that had plenty of room is actually doing so much better. And I'm harvesting it now. At the end of October, they're ready. And again, earliest that I've ever been able to harvest broccoli. But the ones in the raised beds aren't ready, which honestly will work out fine because I would like to have a longer harvest just like with cabbage. But it was an interesting observation to see how differently they ended up growing when they didn't have competition compared to being right next to each other. Also, the ones that are right next to each other are much taller plants. And I wonder if part of that is because they're competing a little bit with each other. It's really strange. Even though they're different varieties, they're not Gemini. They're the same varieties that I planted in the spring, yet their growth habit is much taller than it was in the spring. So just some observations. I'm not sure that I can make a lot of conclusions with that quite yet, but it has been interesting to see. Now, I also had 2 broccoli planted in 7-gallon grow bags, and these plants looked great for a while, but then I had trouble keeping enough water with them. At least one of them would wilt a lot. They're not forming heads yet. I'm just not thinking a 7-gallon grow bag is enough for a broccoli. And I may end up, taking a look at the root structure, taking it out of the grow bag at some point. But at this point, I'm thinking what that's telling me is I'm not sure that that's big enough. And you would think a 7-gallon grow bag would be good for one broccoli, but I'm just not seeing good results with that at all. Number 2, as far as what's going well, is lettuce and greens. This is something that I've really dialed in. I planted some directly from seed out in the garden. Well, I put them under shade for a little while until the heat started kind of coming down a little bit, and then the angle of the sun got to where I could tell it really wasn't bothering them as much. But then I also planted some lettuce indoors, and I planted those out in the heat of the summer, but I either put them under shade cloth, or I planted them on the north side of my green stalk, and that was able to provide me with lettuce greens really early. I think September maybe, I got my lettuce greens, and I'm still getting them. And I'm still continuing to plant those. I had some that I planted indoors. I'm getting ready to plant them outside that are going to be my more winter hardy lettuce. And I'm still continuing to sow greens in my green stalk and in my gardens. I have not had to buy salad greens in over a year because I'm continually planting salad greens. And I eat salads almost every day. So that saves so much money just to be able to do that. But it takes continually planting, continually sowing. And when I say continually, I'm saying every couple of weeks I'm planting something, whether I'm planting it indoors or I'm direct sowing it in the garden. That continual planting definitely makes a big difference. As we wrap up, keeping in mind both the failures and the successes, I want to share with you what role I believe planning out my fall garden and executing that plan actually played in all of this. The first thing was in the planning. I learned my climate. Knowing what my climate was helped me to know when is the optimal time to plant. And I definitely nailed that. So the plants that I planted, I feel like I planted them at the right time. That partly came from learning my climate, which is one thing that if you're not sure what your climate is and how that plays a role in plant timing, that's one of the key features of Dream to Garden if you're interested in that. But also over the years, observing, seeing how plants behave. Like I said before, when I planted spinach seeds in September, I observed that they didn't sprout. So those are the types of things that are only going to come in with observation. But as far as executing my plan that I had made, I started my planning of my fall garden in January. I refined it in July, but for the most part, I'm still working the plan that I made months ago. I nailed that. But where I find that I'm lacking is in caring for my plants this time of year, because it's so much easier to care for your plants in the spring. By the time summer comes, you're just kind of over it to some degree. I just found that I just wasn't as diligent as I should have been. And to be able to get a better fall garden next year, I need to improve in this area. I need to improve on making sure that my young seedlings are getting enough water. I know it. I've been teaching it to you, but it's just an area that I've gotten lax on, that I know that I need to get better at next year if I'm going to have better results. And finally, I need to add fertilizing on my planting calendar for my containers, my green stock, my grow bags, any kind of containers that I use. I think I got lazy because with my in-ground beds and with my raised beds, because I've paid such attention to the soil, I've really never had to fertilize. And so I kind of took that mindset with me into containers, and I'm realizing that that's not the best thing. And when I have taken the time to fertilize my containers, and usually it's in the spring because I have motivation to do it, I have much better results. So in order to be able to do that at the time of the year when I'm tired, it needs to be on my calendar. I need to plan when I'm going to fertilize, and that's a way that I think that I can also get better at my fall garden next year. So I hope that by my sharing with you these failures that I've had this year and also the successes, I hope that it's been helpful for you, especially if you found that your garden, whether it was your fall garden or it's your spring or summer garden, hasn't been everything that you expected it to be. I hope that it encourages you that we're not all perfect. And despite what we may see online, I mean, to be honest with you, it would have been easy for me to just sweep all of this under the rug and just show you my broccoli and just show you my cabbage. And just conveniently, you don't ever see carrots, but you may not wonder why, right? But I wanted to share with you because this is real. Because no matter how long you've been gardening, we're going to have these garden frustrations. We're going to have these garden learning opportunities that we also call failures. And that's part of the fun of it. And I don't want us to get discouraged. So hopefully this was helpful for you. And just as a reminder, I absolutely feel 100% that your best garden starts when you've been able to take time to plan it and plan it strategically. And not only like, what am I going to plant, but how to plan your entire year's garden from your early spring plantings that sometimes are going to start in January all the way to my last planting is coming up in November. By the time you hear this, I may have planted garlic, but planning all of that from start to finish is what is going to set you up for a successful 3-season garden. And I teach you how to do all of that in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden. It's the perfect time to join if you have a little extra time in the fall when you're not in your garden. I hope to see you there. Again, journeywithjill.net/dream to garden. And you can find a lot more information on what's involved and what you'll get at the link in the show notes. And if you know that this is the right next step for you, I will be glad to see you in the course. And I hope that I can watch your garden grow to even better success next year. Thank you so much for joining me in today's episode, and I will chat with you next week.